Good morning and welcome back to the second day of our first annual conference. As we did yesterday, we promised to be very punctual, so please help us with that. And without further ado, we will start with, I invite Professor Ruth Halperin-Kedari to open the first session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ronnie. It is really my great pleasure and honor to chair this first session of the second day of your very, very important conference. And this session is very close to my heart. It relates to issues that I've been dealing with as the head, the academic director of the Rachman Center for the Advancement of the Status of Women for many, many years. And in my role as the vice chairperson of the CEDAW committee, the UN Committee on the Elimination of the, of discrimination, of all forms of discrimination against women. And it is very close to my heart because it actually honors and launches the book, The Child of Dr. Yifat Carmel, who makes an enormously important contribution to this field of domestic violence and children exposed to domestic violence. And we will hear directly from Yifat in the 20 minutes that she was allocated to summarize all her, we can actually say, life work. And I believe that she will stand to this challenge. And I will just say a few more things about Yifat. Dr. Yifat Carmel is the head of the Educational Counseling Department at the Faculty of Counseling, Therapy, and Educational Support at Beit Bell College, and also at the School of Creative Arts Therapies and the Emily Sagol Creative Arts Research Center at Haifa University. Her research areas include child abuse, children exposed to domestic violence, trauma and trauma recovery. And very, very importantly, she comes to her research with vast clinical experience in consulting work about children exposed to domestic violence, as being formerly the head of child therapy at a very large center for battered women and at the very large center for the treatment and prevention of family violence in Israel. And we'll probably hear more about that from Yifat later. And I really emphasize this because I think that this area of work, of academic work, is probably one of the most important to include the combination of clinical experience and experience, as we say in Hebrew, on the ground with the theoretical understandings. And this is what we're benefiting from, this unique combination that Dr. Yifat Carmel provides us with. So Yifat, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak at this important conference on children's rights and needs. I carry with me many children whom I have met over the years. I promised them that their voices will be heard and that one day we will find a way to remove them from their impossible reality, a reality of captivity. My short lecture will discuss the complex issue of domestic violence, and I will explain the difference between this phenomenon and other family violence phenomena. Child exposure to domestic violence is a particularly complex field of abuse. Its handling by professionals, researchers, and policymakers indicates a lack of understanding, confusion between phenomena, and the presence of political interests which obscure the children's voices. The result is severe harm to the children with no prospect of healing. On the contrary, this approach ensures that they will remain in domestic captivity. Obscuring the children's voices poses no less serious implications for the entire family violence field. So, what are the characteristics of the extremely complex context of domestic violence, which over the years has been referred to by different names and had new elements added to it that in most cases have no connection to it whatsoever? Domestic violence is a context in which a child abuse occurs. This has been proven clearly and empirically. The field generally incorporates all types of child abuse, psychological and emotional abuse, neglect, and frequently even the man's physical and or sexual abuse of the children. In the intrafamilial domestic reality, conflicts between the couple involve physical violence, verbal aggression, sexual, emotional, psychological, and economic abuse as part of the man's deliberate, multifaceted, obsessive campaign of control aimed to enclose the woman in a ring of captivity. The phenomenon has prominent gender characteristics. In most cases, it is the men who are violent toward the women, derived from the men's own early experiences of abuse. This difficult childhood experience of abuse, violence, and alienation, as well as physical and emotional abandonment, have resulted in an obsessive pathological need to create intimacy. The only way the man can create intimacy is by exerting control over the woman and preventing her from leaving. From his point of view, if the woman leaves, he will be cast back into the abyss of loneliness. The problem is that as the ring of control tightens around the woman, her sense of repulsion increases. Her emotional distancing from the man strengthens his motivation to close the ring even more tightly. So she distances herself even further, creating self perpetuating dynamics. In the domestic violence context, it is essential to understand that, as opposed to the prevalent view, for these men, vindictiveness is secondary to their deep sense of existential loneliness, which leads them to both murder and suicide. Their lives without their women have no meaning. They see the children as an extension of her and cannot relate to them as subjects in themselves. This is a genuine pathology, even though the DSM does not define it as such, which creates a real problem for the legal system. Besides the high percentage of direct abuse among this child population, the essence of abuse that the literature refers to as witnessing violence or exposure to violence has not pervaded the public awareness or the legal and professional therapeutic spaces. Piercing testimony to this is the question posed repeatedly in broad legal and professional contexts. If the man abuses the woman, why does this necessarily mean that he abuses the children? So, what is the essence of the abuse referred to as witnessing or exposure to violence? And why is this a particularly serious form of abuse? A type of abuse previously included in the obligation to report. At the heart of the abuse in witnessing violence is distortion of the perception of reality. The violent parts of the reality are connected to normativity, so that children learn to perceive the non-normative as normative. They learn how to fill the gaps in accordance with parental scripts learned at home. All the family members get used to trivializing the violence and to turning it into a part of the daily routine, as well as learning how to justify it as no choice behavior. The woman, as a captive who is forced to start thinking through the filter of her husband in order to survive and protect her children in the reality of captivity, supposedly turns into a kind of collaborator in creating those scripts. The children learn their role in the scenario to allow expression of those scripts, and by giving their function a normative title, they perceive the internal domestic reality as normative. These scripts dissolve, of course, when the children are faced with the reality outside, and hence they experience their reality as half true and half false. What draws the children in those violent scripts? The sense of normativity. There, in those violent events, they feel that everything connects. This sense of togetherness with parents and siblings, explanations for what is happening, feeling united for the sake of a goal and the interest derived from the event. And all of these are enveloped within a state of heightened emotion, the direct opposite of the day-to-day sense of terrible emptiness. The children seemingly have two realities. One, domestic routine characterized by fathomless emptiness, by vacuum and genuine nothingness. And two, the escalation, which supplies the children with interest and tension. The violent events are like pockets of life that inject vitality into the emptiness, as well as providing a normative context for what is happening. Unlike the internal domestic routine that is experienced as desolate and lacking in vitality, it is specifically in the breakage that comes with those violent pockets of life that the children experience fullness and wholeness and thus are swept up into the situation. Although the parents teach the children how to mend the break and the fractured reality, these scripts are predictable and therefore boring. Following the mending of the fractures, when the children compare the outcome to the external everyday reality, it appears discordant, half true and half false. Whereas during the violent incidents, assembly of the parts into a whole works well for them because it is experienced as normative. Given these insights from research in the field, we must ask the following question. Why has this profound child abuse, which explains the particularly high percentage of direct abuse, not penetrated professional awareness in therapeutic and legal contexts? Having identified the obscuring of the children's voices, I had the idea on investigating the reasons behind this bizarre situation. The main discovery presented in my book is that the answer to these questions are related to the complex gender discourse between men and women. Since the political interests of women's and men's rights are at the center of this discourse, the children's voices are obscured. I will now explain what this means. The advance of research on children's reactions to the violent reality in which they live increasingly exposed the severe, multifaceted abuse that they had experienced. Following this development, it was clearly necessary to create concrete therapeutic responses to help children cope with their complex reality. Empowering the women alongside providing home support and parental guidance were a part of this plan. The assumption was that since the woman herself was a direct victim of violence, as soon as she would receive the appropriate support as essential help, she would be able to break out of the circle of violence, to release herself and her children from their complex reality of captivity. However, this assumption turned out to be erroneous. The scientific literature shows that despite the help these women received, they often had difficulty leaving the violent relationship. A critical analysis of the policy adopted at that stage regarding the treatment of the children pointed to a kind of back and forth movement between two approaches. Even though the definition of the approaches changed, each time in essence they remained the same. Specifically, I learned from the following two intervention approaches. One, attempts to include the field of children's exposure to domestic violence under the child protection heading, necessitating the obligation to report and regarding the children as a subject to high risk. And two, attempts to shape the child intervention as part of the general treatment of the phenomenon of violence against women. It is important to note that the first approach proposes that the children be regarded as victims of domestic captivity circumstances and that intervention be provided accordingly, meaning that this is an outcome of the captor-captive dynamics in which the woman is incapable of leaving the domestic captivity and is thus unable to remove her children from the situation as well. Feminist researchers have criticized this perception, claiming that the woman may feel blamed by the society and even worse, held responsible for the children's difficult situation. In contrast, the other approach suggests viewing the children as victims of the abusive man and intervening with them as such. In this context, the child abuse is perceived as an extension of the abuse of the woman, and the woman's judgment of how to handle the risk to herself and to her children is always considered correct. Even though this approach solves the problem of placing responsibility on the woman, it disregards the unique nature of the child abuse. In this situation of captivity, in which the woman must survive, she is forced to take her captor's perspective. These circumstances often place her in a problematic position regarding the children. The constant transition between the two approaches over the years without successfully creating real solutions for the children has led to a dead end. The astonishing thing is that even though the research pointed to the need for a thorough exploration of the children's experience to create context-based interventions, no change in research direction occurred. In addition to this complexity is the legal handling of child arrangement orders in cases involving domestic violence. In this context, a bizarre situation was exposed. Despite clear empirical findings regarding the dangers of violent men's fatherhood, this element was not considered. The anomaly exposed in policy shaping for intervening with these children demands attention to the considerations that guided and continue to guide those policymakers. The analysis can indicate the significant role of social processes and of ethical, professional, and legal ideologies. Specifically, asserting the children's position as victims when the state of captivity does not always allow their mother to protect them would damage or erode the women's victim status. This happened in the United States. As women began to sense the threat of being blamed for deficient parenting and were afraid that the children would be removed from their care, the number of applications to the authorities significantly reduced. This moral conflict and the fear that society will turn the victim into the guilty party became a central consideration that overshadowed the children's status as victims. The issue of child arrangement orders is in the context of women's attempts to separate from her partner is another area that can explain the considerations for shaping child intervention policy. An analysis of the criteria guiding the courts over the years reveals that in the context of exposure to violence, reduction of interparental conflict to the minimum, as well as protecting the child against the abusive, violent environment, were found to be essential prerequisite for the children's recovery and healing. Nonetheless, in the legal context, the criterion of relationship with the father takes precedence over child protection. Based on the above analysis, the question that must be asked is, what does this achieve? Whom does it serve? Relating to the man as abusive toward the woman while disregarding the domestic captivity that it creates for the children as well, in fact makes a distinction between the man in the couple context and the man in the parental context. This perspective, in which the man can be seen in two dimensions, is in keeping with social processes that are attempting to shape a perception of fathers' equality and their involvement in all the family domains. Thus, it can be claimed that placing the child abuse in the spotlight might have placed a large group of men under threat, regressing them to situations in which they are judged from a distance and pathological perspective. Research findings in the domestic violence context reported that approximately 5% of women in Western populations were victims of obsessive control type of violence, and thus predicts much higher percentage in patriarchal society. Thus, a win-win situation was created in which it was in the interest of both women's and men's organizations to obscure the children's voices. Having elucidated the current lack in the scientific literature and out of the desire to create a fitting solution for the children, I set forth new theoretical, empirically based insights. Drawing on these insights in chapter 5 and 6 of the book, I developed a context-based intervention program, and following on from the above, wrote directions for work that can be used as a framework for shaping new policy in the field in chapter 7. These work directions are as follows. 1. Sociological context. In my view, a significant step towards solving the problem will be to create new conceptualizations regarding women as captivity survivor mothers, as well as toward distinctive definitions of different family violence phenomena. That is to say, a change in approach is needed regarding the woman, rather than holding her responsible for removing the children from the abusive dynamics. She herself must be recognized as victim of captivity circumstances. Regarding the men, precise definitions of the items included under the concepts of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, situational violence, patriarchal violence, and gender-based violence will enable a clear distinction between different family violence fields. These precise distinctions will enable recognition of the existence of a specific group of violent men whose behavior can on no account be projected onto the general male population or onto other phenomena in which violent behavior is involved in intimate context. 2. In the legal context, the assumption must be that the domestic space is the most important for the intervention success, specifically without the following conditions: providing a healthy space for the children, no intervention will work. A, when the woman is attempting to leave the relationship, the court must shape a child arrangement orders appropriate to her captivity circumstances, either by reducing the visits and introducing supervision, or suspending the visits to evaluate the risk. Thus, it will be possible to reduce exposure to abusive interparental conflicts, as well as the abusive use of children. It is well known that in cases where the woman is trying to separate from the man, the children become his main weapon through which to harm her. B, when the parents continue living in the same environment, the children's time spent at home can be significantly reduced by including them in meaningful and empowering community projects. Spending most hours of the day in a normative space outside the home will be part of the child protection program as an alternative to an out-of-home residential placement. C, in cases of concrete suspicion of direct abuse, in addition to witnessing to violence, when the mother is incapable of leaving the couple relationship, the child will be placed outside the home with the mother's full inclusion in parenting. For the intervention itself, please refer to chapters 5 and 6 of the book. Thank you.
The original plan was to move now to our commentator, Professor Bob Geffner from Canada, but unfortunately, I understand that he's not available yet on the Zoom. So we will proceed with my comments, and I'll try to do my best. First of all, thank you very much, Ifat. I think that we all could get the impression of how rich and how complex Yifat's analysis is. And I have to admit that this is, you won't be surprised to hear that this is not the first time that I hear it. And when thinking of my comments to today's presentation, I went back to my notes when I first heard Yifat's theory. And I could remember how hard it was for me to, I'll use the word from the Hebrew translation, to digest, to actually digest, to understand fully what she is saying, because what she is saying is extremely not trivial at all. It is the opposite of trivial. It is extremely courageous. And her conclusions are also not easy to grasp. And I'm not saying that I agree to all her conclusions, but I want to point out to the innovative and original and not trivial elements in Yifat's analysis. Why are they so difficult to grasp? Because they go entirely against the dominant discourse, which has become quite hegemonic in many, many circles of the child abuse and domestic violence circles, which is the discourse of symmetry between men's violence and women's violence, and intimate partner violence, which goes both ways, and situational violence that is only the result of the matrimonial crisis and the woman's desire to leave, to separate. And Yifat says very, very clearly, we have to realize that there are different types of violence, and there are gender differences between these different types of violence. And she says courageously, what could be interpreted by some to be a blank indictment against the whole men race. Obviously, you say this is not an indictment against all men, but we have to face the reality. There are different types of violence, and they go way back. And you also explain the evolvement of the cycle of violence and the intergenerational cycle of violence, which actually adapt to many of the research findings. But as you correctly say, the political correctness and the zeitgeist, I think, prevents us from actually accepting the clear conclusions. And the conclusions are that what we sometimes refer to as coercive control, and this is another terminology that is more familiar for those who deal with domestic violence and this whole field of research and work. Coercive control, which is typical to men's violence against women in intimate relations, it actually becomes a state of captivity. And this notion, this new terminology of captivity, I think is extremely important. And I really hope that we will all be able to... Has he joined? Oh, good. Okay. Hi, Bob. So I really hope that we will all be able to get acquainted with this concept and to make more and more use of it, because as Yifat shows throughout the book, it leads to very, very concrete outcomes, including practical outcomes and practical conclusions. Maybe I'll just point out to some of them that they will be, in the back of our minds. the fact that sometimes it could actually be beneficial for children to be taken out of the home, not, as you say, not as a permanent placement, out of home placement, but for a longer terms during the days, in order to allow them to experience a reality which is remote from their daily captivity. Again, you very eloquently and very maybe I would say in a frightening way, you describe the reality of these children, the distorted reality. Again, remembering the first time that I heard it, I was kind of objecting to accept this description that the children are actually even facilitators in elevating the degree of the violence because of the excitement that they may experience in these pockets of violence. This is so difficult to grasp, but relying on your clinical experience and on research, psychological research, it might actually describe correctly, and we have to draw conclusions from that. So the conclusion about maybe sometimes more beneficial to have children be placed for a number of hours during the day on a regular basis out of the home, to actually separate between the needs and the interests of the children and the mothers, not as antagonistic to each other, but to understand that they might not always collide, and women need a different type of intervention and assistance to pull them out of the captivity, and the children may need a different type of assistance and intervention to take them out of the captivity, because the captivity experience is different from the mothers, for the mothers and for the children. And we haven't actually even said one word about parental alienation, but I think I will leave that if we have time after Bob Geffner's remarks. And I'm very glad to understand that Bob was able to join us online. So I will introduce Dr. Bob Geffner. Sorry?
Could you please do this for him here so we can
Oh.
open the Zoom again?
Sure, yes. This works? Mic works? Okay. So Dr. Bob Geffner is founding president of a nonprofit International Resource Training, Research and Direct Service Center, which actually celebrates its 40th anniversary. That means he was heading this for 40 years. We're talking about lifetime work, so definitely lifetime work and achievement. 40th anniversary in 2025, and that's the Family Violence and Sexual Assault Institute at the Institute of Violence, Abuse and Trauma. Can I continue? Okay. He was a professor of psychology at University of Texas Tyler for 16 years and recently retired after 25 years as a distinguished research professor of psychology at Alliant International University, San Diego. He's editor-in-chief of 3 professional peer-reviewed, internationally disseminated journals. He has been licensed clinician for over 45 years and has written, edited, co-authored, co-edited over 100 published professional books, chapters, journals, articles, technical reports on numerous topics in trauma, family, child abuse, and all that's related to that, and has been very, very actively in giving lectures to audiences throughout the United States and in many other countries. And on a personal basis, I can say that he is tremendously important partner in the work that many of us are doing on the international front in trying to confront the rising levels of not just of violence, but also the backlash against the feminist understandings of intimate partner violence and patriarchal violence. And Bob is a most significant partner in this endeavor. So the floor is yours, Bob.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me. I'm sorry that I wasn't there whenever you started. I thought I was coming in early. I appreciate the invitation. I even wore, because of your conference, one of my Save the Children ties to be relevant. This one says helping children and their families around the world, which I thought was really relevant for this topic. I am really pleased to be invited to give some remarks about some of the issues because I have been involved in this for quite some time. And I really enjoyed Ifat's book. There's some things I would disagree with, but in general, it's overall covered some really important issues. I think what I wanted to start with is just making sure everybody really understands the historical aspects of dealing with children who grow up in homes with intimate partner abuse or violence, because this has only been around a little over 40 years. I mean, the first study by Alan Rosenbaum for his dissertation was in 1981, and that's the first real study that we've had dealing with what was then called child witnesses. Since I can't see the audience, I'm going to assume that many of you are mental health professionals or advocates. Is that a pretty accurate statement?
I think it's a fair statement. There's a variety of students and professionals in the room.
Excellent. Well, in the those days, oh, there's the group. Very good. Modern technology. In those days, the kids we're talking about were called child witnesses. And even the initial research. I don't know how many of you are in the forensic field, but what changed the field from child witnesses to children exposed to domestic violence or who grow up in the homes with intimate partner violence or abuse was actually coincidental. In the book, she cites, or you cite, depending on who I'm talking to, Jim Breling, who was at NIMH at the time, I think. And he and I had a conversation, and I, at that time, which was about 1985 or 6, he was asking me what I thought the next major thing in the field of intimate partner violence would be, and I talked about child witnesses. And for about 10, 15 minutes, we were each talking, and he couldn't understand why that would be an important issue and why child witnesses would even be something that relevant. And we went around and around until finally we realized maybe we weren't talking about the same thing. And that turned out to be true, because what he was talking about were children who testify in court as a witness. And he didn't understand why that would be important. He had no concept at the time from his background that that would be involving children who were witnessing intimate partner violence. At that point, I realized that first, you don't have to be a witness, as you all probably know by now. You just grow up in the home, and that's enough to create the trauma. And in 1988, Alan Rosenbaum, Honor Hughes, and myself wrote a chapter in a handbook of family psychology. And that's when we coined the terms children exposed to domestic violence. So it would make it clear we weren't talking about either children who testify in court or children who have to be seeing the domestic violence. They just have to be in the home or growing up in the home. They don't even have to be in the home when it occurs. So I think that's sort of important to note, because now we've expanded, and children exposed really means exposed to coercive control. And I think that's been one of the most important aspects of dealing with the whole issue of domestic violence and abuse is the better understanding and research of coercive control and how that is producing the trauma that affects these kids that we're all talking about. So it is important to make sure that that is an emphasis. As Ifat, and I actually don't know if I'm pronouncing your name right. Am I?
Yes.
Okay, good. In her book, really talks about gender-based violence. I get a little bit nervous talking about gender-based violence, even though I think we all agree with what the issues are and how it affects mostly women and then boys and girls, because at least 75% of the domestic violence, it is the male who's the perpetrator or the aggressor or the main abuser. But one thing I think we have to watch is that we don't get too caught up in saying that's the only issue. The feminist approach is obviously the one I've followed for a long time, but I also realize that we can get caught up in patriarchy and others and lose some of the main issues. So one of the things that we tend to focus on is the multidisciplinary issues that are involved in children who grow up in these homes. So that means, as many of you in the room probably are, it combines psychology, clinical, forensic, family, trauma, child, all those aspects of psychology, but also social work, the law, education, and the judicial system. It is really a multidisciplinary issue that we need to focus on. And I think that's one of the things we don't want to overlook. I found it really interesting in the book where it's talking about linking research and practice and theory. I think that is really important because for those of you who know about our summits and our international summits that we have one coming up in April in Hawaii. It will be our 22nd there. And then next year will be the 30th summit in San Diego and our 40th anniversary, as was pointed out. But way back in 2000, we really put our theme as linking research, practice, policy, advocacy, and theory. And that's been our sub theme ever since. And what I like about the book and what I think is really important is too many people don't do that. They don't really link those things. And I think we need to make sure that we are dealing with this in an interdisciplinary manner. One of the areas that's still going on and that's sort of frustrating is the misunderstanding of the definition of intimate partner violence and abuse or domestic violence and abuse. And the number of people all over the world, including my country and in yours, who continue to talk about mutual abuse when they're really referring to perhaps mutual aggression, which occurs much more often in families than mutual abuse. Mutual abuse does not occur much because by definition, abuse is a pattern of behavior, of using power and control, coercive control, to get one's needs met at the expense of the other partner. Through intimidation, through threats, through other various sources of power. In order to have mutual abuse, that means both people would be doing this to each other. And what happens and why terminology is so important is if we don't use the right terminology, it minimizes not only the importance of what happens with intimate partner abuse, but the effects of it on both the victim and the child or children. And we still see this. I do a lot of testifying in court cases, child custody cases. And I did a presentation in the conference in Haifa, probably the third one I attended, probably about 5-6 years ago, and did a presentation talking about the issues of using the words high conflict when we're really talking about intimate partner violence, because it implies equal power, and that's not what occurs. And it was interesting, the part I came in on at the end of the talk there was parental alienation. There's large international lists now really fighting against the way that term and phrase is being used in family courts worldwide. We've written in lots of special issues in the journals we edit, and we have more coming in about what we call the sort of the myth of parental alienation. Alienating behaviors exist when one parent tries to turn a child against the other parent. But domestic violence, intimate partner abuse, occurs at much higher rates. We have much more research over the 50 years, and we know prevalence, and we know all these types of research studies that have been done on the effects. There is no diagnosis, there is no syndrome, there is no disorder called parental alienation. It's another type of behavior that can occur. But what happens is when we deal with custody cases, and in Israel as well, unfortunately, and abuse, domestic violence, or child abuse is mentioned, immediately the other person yells parental alienation because the kids don't want to be around that person. We know from trauma psychology, from family psychology, from child psychology, that when kids are exposed to intimate partner abuse, that is an adverse childhood experience. And it is a normal response not to want to be around that parent. And that has nothing to do with a parent trying to turn that child against the other parent. Now, we've had cases where that does happen, but nowhere near what we have with intimate partner abuse. So I just wanted to emphasize those things because I thought when I spoke there that many years ago, that people like many of you in the room were really doing a good job countering that, and it wasn't taking hold. And now I hear from friends in Israel that it's not gone away and it's still occurring, unfortunately, too often, and definitely in my country. And even the people we have discredited in my country are now going to Europe, Australia, New Zealand to push their ideas. So these are all key issues when we're talking about what happens to children. Another key point I wanted to mention, and I agreed with the book and what Yifat said, is the research is pretty clear. Children understand and are definitely aware, even at very young ages, of what goes on in the family. And when there's this type of abuse, they know about it. Whether parents think they do or don't, they do. And that's important when you're talking about intervention, because the effects of being exposed to this are pretty profound. And I think that was clear in the book, and I agreed with that. I think the varied responses and how the book does a better job than most of talking about how different kids at different ages, different genders react differently to being exposed to this. And I think that's something we need to emphasize more, because if there are varied responses, it by definition means one size doesn't fit all. And that's one of the things I've been pushing for decades now, is in order to be able to really have a more successful intervention, it means you have to figure out what the issues are. So what that means is assessment-based intervention is the key. It has to be tailored to the needs of the child or children, which means you have to beef up the intake and the assessment. And that doesn't happen as often as I would like to see, where the organization or agency or the therapist or the practitioner is spending more time in the initial assessment and interviews to determine what is the best types of intervention. And now everybody is talking about evidence-based versus promising practices, and now some people are talking about research-informed. The problem is you can't really do a good random study of evidence-based practice that is required by definition of what evidence-based means with random control, etc. random assignment and experimental controls, when you're tailoring the intervention to the particular individual. So you really can't have that type of evidence base. What you really need is more of promising practices, which means pre and post assessment. Are the people who are getting the intervention, the kids, are they actually improving? Are they reducing their trauma? Are they increasing their self-esteem? Are they reducing their anxiety? Are they becoming more empowered? So that can be done, and we don't do that as much. But what that also implies is, as the book talks about, ecological approach, that's something I agree with, a biopsychosocial or bioecological approach, because you have to be able to deal with that. You have to be able to deal with the trauma, what the trauma does to the brain, what we've learned about the neurobiology of trauma, and what happens to kids when they're chronically traumatized. So we have to be able to use a biopsychosocial, interdisciplinary, multimodal, multidimensional approach to treating these kids. What I think we haven't done enough of, and I'd love to see more of you and other research, is also focusing not only on women who are abused, but there are about 20% of the families where the abuser is the female. And we've had those cases, and it shows up in the research. And in many ways, they act in the same manner as the male abuser. But we don't have as much research on the females who are abusive and what that does to the kids. So that's going to be your next book, is going to focus on that and LGBTQ parents and what happens to kids in these families when there's intimate partner abuse. And as I said, we deal with it at our institute in one of our departments, which does direct services, but there's not a standard practice of doing these things. The other thing I think I wanted to mention, and I don't have a
Bob,
time.
can I just, yes.
Yeah, am
can
I
I
running
just
out of
say,
time, or did I run out
um,
already?
Pretty much, so maybe
Okay,
just one last point and wrap up. Thank you, because
okay.
I want to give Yifat the opportunity also to react.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I think we have to watch that we don't blame victims. We know about victims who become victimizers. We know about this as a learned behavior. And I'm not Freudian, but I have seen and I agree with the idea of identifying with power. And I've seen where kids see that power works and they get what they want in these relationships. And so they identify and can become abusive themselves. And we need more research on that as well. The only other thing I would add, and then I can come back and answer questions as well after Ifat speaks, is we still don't do a good enough job in dealing with the policies that are recommended in the book or that we recommend, where we really emphasize listening to the kids enough and focusing on children's rights. We're still focused much more on parent rights, and very few countries really have a no or zero tolerance for intimate partner violence and what it does to the kids. So I think that really needs to be in more statutes and more laws and more governmental policies. So let me stop there and let responses continue.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bob. These were very, very important insights, and I think they gave us much more food for thought, and also making many of the elements fall into place. I'm conscious of the time. We don't have much time before we need to wrap up this session.
What time does this session end? I was told it ended at 9:30 your time, 1:30 my time.
Well, we started
Or
at 9:30
yes.
our time, and we were supposed to finish at 4:30 our time. Sorry, 10:30 our time, which is now.
Oh, You guys are 10 hours ahead instead of 9? Because my Zoom had it at 12:30 my time to 1:30 my time.
Oh, sorry about this misunderstanding. But maybe we would move on to Yifat now if you want to respond, and then we'll see. Yes, because I see that Yifat is really eager to say a few more things, and I think that she really deserves to have the platform. So
Thank you.
maybe from here.
From here.
Yes. So
Okay. Several very interesting issues have been raised here, but as time is short, I would like to focus on some very important points. One, since there are different family violence phenomena, it is crucial for the court to differentiate between these phenomena and domestic violence cases. The following questions can help the court to differentiate between these cases. One, was the violence always an inherent part of the couple's relationship? Two, and if it was, did it contain elements of pathological control? If the answer is yes to both these questions, the court will need to work according to the domestic violence framework. And if not, the healthy environment for the child will be shaped according to a different context of understanding. Two, the main thing to understand about the pathology is that the man uses any means possible to tighten the ring of captivity around the woman and to maintain his control. In cases in which the woman is trying to separate, he uses the children as his main weapon against her. Therefore, the child visiting arrangement orders must be adapted to the pathology. And I would like to emphasize the difference between highly intense conflicts with violent patterns as opposed to domestic violent conflicts. In highly intense conflicts, such as situational violence or intimate partner violence, when the couple separate with time, they will accept the child arrangement orders. In domestic violence cases, the man will use the child arrangement orders in an abusive way and will not accept the new situation. Three, court order intervention based on evidence results in incrimination and punishment of the abuser, while all the children want is a safe environment. So when there is a reasonable impression that pathological control is present, suitable child arrangement orders can meet the need for a safe environment and for continuing the children's relationship with the father. We have to understand that it is a win-win situation in which the child can continue to be in relationship with his father in a safety environment, and the father can keep to be in relationship with the child, but in a way that he experiences himself as a good father and not as abusive one. Four, in domestic violence cases, child intervention must be indirect because any change in the domestic reality might pose a threat to the woman and to the children. As I said earlier, you can read about the intervention in chapters 5 and 6. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think this was really very important to set it back on the ground and see how practical and how relevant your insights are and how they can and should be translated into actual protocols and arrangements relating to visitation and allocation of parental time when parents separate. And I think, Bob, this relates to what you said in the ending of your comments about the too few legislators around the world that are actually aware of the conclusions from such research as the research that you are leading and heading, and what Yifat comes up in her book. And there's no doubt that we have a lot of work to do those of us in this area who are trying to translate these insights into actual policy and practical guidelines. Since I'm afraid we did run out of time, I will end up this session now. And apologies again for the misunderstanding about the timing. There's still a lot to learn in these transatlantic conferences. But thank you so much, Bob, for coming online at this late hour for you over there. And hope to be continued this partnership. And thank you so much, Ifat, for giving us this important work. Thank you for the organizing of the conference.
Thank you.